Welcome to this meeting of the Canadian Society of Presbyterian History. My name is Stuart Macdonald and I am the president. I'm also going to end up being the first presenter, so I'm going to kick it over to my colleagues. We have two papers, some questions. Then we're going to have the break for the annual meeting, and then we're going to move to our final paper, and we will be done by 3. That's our plan. Thank you. Robert, if I could turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, someone who will be familiar to, I suspect, all of you, and that is Stuart. Professor Stuart Macdonald is Professor of Church and Society at Knox College. He has published on 17th century Scotland, particularly witchcraft accusations, and along with his colleague Brian Clark, has written about the changing religious demographics in Canada since 1945, including the book Leaving Christianity. He's also written on various topics related to the history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, including the church in World War I, theological developments, and the building of new churches in suburban Canada. So let's all welcome Stuart with our first paper today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. You can see that I've changed the title slightly. 1966 and all that, the liberty of conscience debate in context. It's essentially the same idea, but I've just added a little twist. So let me begin. Something different happened in the lead up to the 1979 General Assembly. In his report on General Assembly in the June-July issue of the Presbyterian Record, the new editor, it was only his second year, and it's the one where we really begin to see him putting his stamp on the publication. It's James Ross Dickey, or Jim Dickey, but he noted that no less than 10, and he capitalized the 10, capital T, capital E, capital N, overtures were directed to the Assembly on one issue. He concluded that section, as far as can be determined, the accumulation of 10 overtures, all addressed on the same subject, was unprecedented, at least in recent Presbyterian history. Aha! Those of us with some knowledge of the history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada go, this must be the beginning of what has come to be known as the liberty of conscience debate, the second and more contentious debate about the decision to ordain women as ministers and elders in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Except it wasn't. This was about a completely different issue. Indeed, a debate in the church we've generally forgotten about. And I want to say a little bit more about that later on in the paper. But the timing of this controversy and the seemingly new tactic of a flurry of overtures, and the similarity with what happened just 2 years later, when again there was a flurry of overtures, this time related to the issues around the ordination of women, suggests we need to consider what was happening. It also invites us to do something we have at times struggled to do, and that is to place the debate on the ordination of women within the Presbyterian Church in Canada into a larger context and see it in that context. Let's remind ourselves how the Presbyterian Church in Canada came to the decision to ordain women. Discussions began in the mid-1950s, which proved inconclusive. Recent historical work has been done on this, myself to this society a few years ago. Peter Bush has written a fine article in Presbyterian history. The place of Women Committee was reinvigorated in the early 1960s and produced the important study guide, Putting Woman in Her Place. And the General Assembly made the decision to ordain women as both ruling elders, that is, members of session, and thus also eligible to serve at presbytery synods and general assemblies, and teaching elders or ministers of word and sacrament. While there were dissents at the 1966 General Assembly, this did not become that specific moment, at that specific moment, the source of controversy and division that came later. Indeed, it was a little over a decade later that this emerged as one of the major issues that seemed to divide the denomination. This issue dominated the General Assembly. In this later debate, starting around in 1979 and going to about 1982, is often referred to as the liberty of conscience debate. And the gap between the decision to ordain and the later controversy has been puzzling. Some have suggested this is a pattern we see in other denominations in other countries who've also made the decision to ordain women. And that may be true. I've just never seen any systematic analysis of this. Don McLeod, in his article on the origins of the Renewal Fellowship, suggests several reasons for the delay, including a fear on the part of evangelicals of being seen as following a divisive course, even though they disagreed with the decision. Joanne Dixon, in a paper presented to this society in 2012, drew our attention to the increasing number of women moving into ministry in the late 1970s, and in particular, the challenge this created at the mission board, given that all moving into congregational ministry needed to be placed in a congregation under the ordained missionary appointment system. And she documents the tension between the mission board and the students of Presbyterian College, which led to a memorial, the Montreal Memorial, coming to the 1979 General Assembly and raising the issue of the discrimination of women moving into ministry and that they were facing. She argues that this may have proved to be one factor in precipitating the liberty of conscience debate. And I would agree. In the paper I presented to this society a few years ago on the 1966 decision, I added to this conversation the argument that the most immediate result of the decision made in 1966 was to allow for women to be elders. I also suggested at the time, that is in 1966, few on either side seem to have anticipated that a significant number of women might wish to become ministers. When this did happen, as Joanne Dixon and others have pointed out, in the late 1970s, this is what created a new and quite different situation. And we thus have some developing of idea of why the tensions on the issue of women's ordination seem to have been more intense over a decade after the decision. What I want to do today is lay out clearly what happened and kind of when. So just go over the debate and try and set it up. And so we can understand what in a rather confusing situation happened at various times. So that's the first thing. And in doing that, I also want to correct one misunderstanding which has crept into the history of the denomination in recent years. Second, I want to begin the process of placing these events in their context. The context for the debate in 1979, I believe, is crucial to our understanding of what happened. One of my arguments will be that this is about far more than the place of women in the church. Indeed, to put it fairly simply, I'm going to suggest that this is a moment where something different happens or seems to happen. We might even talk about this as when the culture war debates that we now talk about began to affect the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So that's what that's kind of where I'm going to go. So let's begin with what happened and when. And I'll do this fairly rapidly in the presentation and then trying to expand it in the final version. and correct anything I've got wrong. It's a very confusing debate. I do have to say that. I'm going to suggest we begin, though, in 1979. The controversy between the mission board and graduating students that was focused at Presbyterian College in Montreal. This ran through February and March, and as noted, is well covered by Joanne Dixon's paper. The result was Memorial 1 from the Presbytery of Montreal to the General Assembly. A commission was established, and this continued to be of concern at the 1980 General Assembly. So this is dealt with over 2 General Assemblies. What happens next is kind of interesting. And I've printed on 2 sides of the paper, and now I've found the side. The link between that event and what happens next is unclear, but I suggest it's hard to imagine that they're not connected. The mission board had already appointed a graduating student who had done his theological education at Westminster Theological Seminary to an ordained missionary charge. The Board of Education, who had jurisdiction over graduates who'd done their theological education outside of Knox and Presbyterian College, turned the candidate down because this graduate, Dan McDougall, voiced his disagreement with the Presbyterian Church in Canada's position on the ordination of women, and he claimed liberty of conscience. This decision was appealed at the Presbytery of East Toronto with a request from his home congregation that he be ordained. This was turned down in a very close vote, appealed to the Synod, and then appealed again to the General Assembly. And that's how it arrives at the 1980 General Assembly, alongside several overtures, a memorial, and an appeal on this issue. During the assembly, a committee is created which makes several decisions to allow for the ordination of induction of this particular individual. However, after this, there would be no further exceptions. Instead, the committee proposed a 10-year period where people would have more freedom, but after this, everyone would need to participate in the ordination of women. And the result of that pleased no one on either side. We then get a flurry of overtures, depending on how you count, 23 to 27 related to this issue, appear before the next General Assembly in 1981. And this assembly makes a few decisions. They remove that 10-year provision, but a special task force is created to report to the 1982 General Assembly. And between 1981 and 1982, a further issue emerges when the Presbytery of Montreal rejects a call from a congregation to a minister, one of the signatories of the 1980 dissent, the Reverend John Vaudreuil. The 1982 General Assembly is thus key. It also receives the majority report of the task force, which was chaired by Margaret Taylor. It also receives a minority report from members of the task force. In the end, the General Assembly affirmed the 1966 decision that ordination was open to all, women and men, allowed for freedom of belief, but not freedom of action. So one couldn't absent oneself from anyone's ordination. Presbyteries were encouraged to be pastoral while recognizing that no one had permission to disobey church laws. This understanding specified was specific to those already ordained. Implicit, though, was the notion that moving forward, anyone being ordained would need to accept this position. And I would just quickly note that this doesn't end the debate. There's more overtures, but this is often when we think of it as being the end. 2 things to note. First, it is easy in the Presbyterian Church in Canada to confuse 2 things. Chapter 20 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which speaks of liberty of conscience generally, and the ordination vows, which allow for liberty of conscience on how one accepts one specific section of the Westminster Confession, specifically chapter 23, the relationship between church and state. And I think we get these confused sometimes, so that's something I would just suggest, and these are quite different. The other thing I just wanted to note is this confusion, indeed a distortion, which seems to have come into our history. Put simply, it's now suggested that liberty of conscience was given in 1966 on the issue of the ordination of women, then rescinded during the debate in the 1980s. At the 2021 General Assembly, Overture 1 from Western Hanka Presbytery incorrectly stated, and I'm quoting, whereas liberty of conscience and action in the remits cannot be guaranteed in perpetuity, according to the Book of Forms and as evidenced in the history of that provision for the ordination of women, which was granted in 1966 and revoked in 1982. The same claim in almost identical language is made in another overture, this time from Eastern Hanka. This did not happen. Liberty of conscience on this issue was not requested in 1966, nor was it granted. Nothing in the reports in this that we've looked at from the task force, which is either the minority or the majority report, references that. So this is an error that's crept in that I think we just need to be aware of. I want to turn and start talking about context for just a minute. And I want to go back to those 10 overtures. They all dealt with complaints from various quarters of the church related to the program to combat racism of the World Council of Churches, specifically the contention that grants had been given to armed guerrilla groups in Africa, which had used violence in Rhodesia and Southern Africa. And so there are various suggestions that the church either look at this or even more firmly withdraw from the World Council on the basis of this. And the text of the overtures is really interesting. It shows that people are aware of the issue, they're connecting, they're talking about similar things. It talks about the actions of other denominations, notably the Presbyterian Church in Ireland and the Salvation Army in one of the 10 overtures. And so this is clearly an issue that has mobilized opposition. And I think it's a really fascinating one to think about because we have in many ways even forgotten that this happened. There's other contentious issues in that crucial year, 1979, but I think it's interesting just to think both about how this is voiced, the opposition to this, in terms of the overtures, as well as what happens at the General Assembly. And I want to suggest that we see here a reflection of something going on in the broader culture. In the broader culture in this period, we see the beginnings of a contesting of the cultural changes that began in the 1960s. The most obvious and telling example is in the United States, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was going to give equal rights to women. In 1972, it was thought that it was going to be a slam dunk. In 1979, it is abandoned because there is so much opposition to it. It can't get enough states to ratify it. Some states that had already ratified it withdraw it. Something is going on here. I would also note two politicians who in particular show a major shift in culture. Both Ronald Reagan, and I would say even more so, Margaret Thatcher, are very much running against the kind of changes in culture that they reflect happening at the time. This is the beginning of the moral majority. So there's all kinds of things going on. And I think we also see this in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and we see this in the debates. And as my time is running out, I am just going to say that this is what I want to explore further in the paper, because it seems to me this debate moves away from just being about women and brings in these other cultural issues. And so while it is about whether women can serve, there are also these cultural issues being brought in, and by both sides. I'm not saying by just one side, but it strikes me that something different is going on here. There's always been divisions in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Let's not be naive about that. But I'm wondering if we aren't seeing something different begin to happen in this period. And so some of the contention within the denomination is reflecting outside networks and outside forces in the culture. So that is my time, and I am going to stop. Thank you very much. We're going to move right into our second speaker. Thank you for sharing your screen, Robert. And I'm going to invite June Wan to introduce Robert.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Stuart. Hello, my name. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jun Won Kim, and I'm a PhD student at Knox College. And in a moment, we will be starting our second presentation from Robert Revington. Robert is a doctoral candidate at Knox College in Church History with 2 previous MAs from McMaster University. He was the first ever recipient of the John A. Mackenzie Scholarship from the Rolf and Barford Foundation. He is also a men's league hockey player and Hamilton Tiger Cats season ticket holder. And once he went skydiving in a Superman costume. Robert's presentation this morning is derived from an upcoming Town of Aurora Museum exhibit for which he is writing the text. I would now invite Robert to present this paper on Retta rank and the history of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Aurora. Robert.
Thank you, June Wan. In the days before St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Aurora, had its own hall, the church once held a Robbie Burns night in the nearby Anglican church. Nonetheless, something truly scandalous by Presbyterian standards occurred that night. According to longtime church member Rita Rank, in that predominantly Scottish congregation, some members almost passed out when they saw this horrifying sight. Those of you of Scottish descent may need a moment to process what I tell you here, as it is truly shocking. What was the scandal? When the bagpiper at the Robbie Burns night walked out, it turned out that he was wearing a kilt with an Irish pattern. I warned you. Perhaps more reasonably, Rita Rank recalls, I thought if he can play a bagpipe, kilt or not, that was all that was necessary. Now, my presentation today is not a typical conference presentation. It represents some of the highlights of a virtual museum exhibit that you will be able to enjoy later this year if you want to, commemorating the 150th anniversary of St. Andrew's Aurora. The church started in 1871. This is not an exhaustive account, but more a series of vignettes. A recurring theme is the resourcefulness of the Presbyterians at the church in the face of adversity. Much of our material will be seen through the eyes of longtime St. Andrew's member Rita Rank, third from the right in that photo. She wrote a valuable autobiographical account of her time at the church, or the church's archives. Her connection to this church covered almost all parts of her life from 1906 to 2005. In that time, she encountered most of the ministers in the church's history. She even has memories of the church's second minister, Reverend Walter Amos, who served the congregation from 1876 until 1912, when Rank was just 6 years old. She described him as a very fine-looking chap who dressed in a frock coat and black hat, and whose suits were always immaculate. She adds, the main reason I liked him was because he had a lovely horse and buggy, and sometimes took her on rides. She notes that this was his transportation for him to call on his parishioners. Although her family were originally Methodist, she writes that at an early age, I must have been destined to be a Presbyterian because she grew up in the house beside the church's organist, Mrs. Watson, and would sometimes go to the church to listen to Mrs. Watson practice. Rank remembers an experience in the old church when she was 14 or 15 years old. She'd been told to go to the church to check on their arthritic caretaker, Mr. Lord. Rank explains there had been complaints that he hadn't dusted the pews very well. She narrates that at this time there was a back door in the old church, sort of a trap door. The steps went into the basement, the dirt floor, and usually very damp. There was a church shed that the folk tied their horses in. Lloyd tripped and fell in this basement, which was flooded, and went right down into it with me hanging onto his coattail. She concludes, I pulled him out, and a very soaking wet caretaker returned home. The membership of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Aurora, grew to 175 by 1924. Nonetheless, the year 1925 permanently changed this church, as it did all Presbyterians in Canada. In Aurora, the debate was bitter, as 71 voted in favor of joining the United Church, and 74 voted to stay Presbyterian. The church stayed Presbyterian by just these 3 votes. That church used to be decorated with a fruit and vegetable display for Thanksgiving, including many apples. Rank writes that the old church had a board floor, and evidently things dropped on it and resounded quite loud. Their emphatic minister, Reverend Dix, used to hit the pulpit occasionally, I guess to bring something to the attention of the congregation. At that time, about 20 boys from nearby St. Andrew's College attended the church. One time, when Reverend Dix hit the pulpit while preaching, the apples flew off, hit about 8 of the boys, and then landed on the floor. She reflects, it really created quite a sound. Since then, we always say no apples in the pulpit at Thanksgiving. The college boys had a glorious laugh along with the congregation. There are many examples in the church's history of its members showing great resourcefulness and ingenuity in the face of adversity. The Great Depression hit the congregation hard. Then Minister G.S. Eldridge even offered to contribute his own money to the church, $25 each quarter and $35 to cover the cost of an organist. Rita Rank describes the 1930s as a time when money was something very few had and was much needed in our church, especially with repairs and coal bills. She adds that a ton of coal cost $12, but even that cost was difficult to come by when we already had almost $600 outstanding. The church wanted to have some kind of fundraiser event, but they were not allowed to have euchre parties because that was too sinful. Nonetheless, they were allowed to play crokinole. They held crokinole tournaments, 12 tables at 25 cents per person to pay for coal. During the winter, the church members had one crokinole party per month to pay for the heating, with different people offering to host. And this was how the church helped heat itself during the lean years of the 1930s. She also remembers that in the 1930s, there was no water in the church. It had to be carried in from the tap outside, almost at the street. We filled wash boilers and heated them on an old cook stove to wash the dishes. Still, she writes, we were never afraid to try anything, even though our church was small and our conveniences nil. One time, the choir from Parkdale Presbyterian Church visited and asked where they could find the washrooms at St. Andrew's Aurora. The church did not have any at that time, so about 20 singers marched to the house of a nearby family from the church, the Baldwins. This experience brought home the fact that the church needed more facilities. Rank also recalls that after this concert, the visiting minister from Parkdale turned down all the wide variety of tarts, pies, and sandwiches he was offered by the people for lunch, saying that he much preferred a bowl of porridge. He got his porridge anyway, thanks to the women of the church. Rank remembers another time when a gentleman came to her house and wanted to hold 2 entertainment events at the church, if the women could take care of the hall and sell tickets. She refused to let the church hold a minstrel show, but it did host a play called The Path Across the Hill by Lillian Mortimer. But as it happened, some posters around town misidentified the play's title as The Path Across to Hell. But perhaps because of this more provocative title, Rank writes, "Believe me, there was no difficulty selling tickets, and we had a full hall." In 1954, there was a great fire on Yonge Street in Aurora, which greatly damaged Thompson's furniture. Rank recalls, "It was January, cold and windy, and the flames spread south." Because tickets had been sold, the Presbyterian Church still had to host a roast beef dinner, but the power was out all over town. How could they prepare the meat? Rank writes, "Cora McDowell had a coal stove, B. Daly's mother had a gas stove and a coal stove, and Mrs. Noble had a cook stove. We carried roasts to all of them, and then the dinner was served at 6:30 p.m. by bringing the food back to the church." This is not the only time the church found a creative solution to a problem. The church organized strawberry socials throughout its history. Rank recalls a strawberry tea in 1924, charging 40 cents for adults and 25 cents for children and a band. One time, when Reverend George Dix showed up to one of the church's strawberry teas, a Miss MacArthur told him he needed to comb his hair immediately. Rank writes, "The ladies were horrified to tell this to the new minister." Strawberry teas took place on the church's lawn with a table, and on the east side of the vestry there was a coal oil stove to heat water for tea and wash the dishes outside. On one June day, church members prayed for good weather for the strawberry tea, but it poured rain in the morning. The rain temporarily stopped, but the sky looked unpromising. She narrates that just at that time, Reverend John Locke, the United Church minister, and a former Presbyterian, Mr. Ferris, came by. Reverend Locke cheekily told the Presbyterians that if they had gone united, the rain would not have come. Rank replied, "You haven't got enough faith. Come back at 3 p.m. The sun will be out and we will serve you strawberries on the lawn." She concludes, "Believe it or not, they did come back, and we did serve the tea on the lawn. And I knew Mr. Ferris didn't like strawberries, so I had a jar of plums ready for him. There was about 150 served tea, and all the dishes were washed outside." Another time, the church could not find strawberries for its social anywhere and needed them soon. Then, Rank remembered a place on the road into Midland that sold them, but didn't know its name. She called the telephone operator and asked if the operator knew who sold berries in Midland. The operator did and rang them up. The church got 2 crates of berries in time. Rank notes that her friend Lydia Baldwin never quite got over that, but when the tickets are sold, you have to produce the merchandise. She also recalls how one night Miss MacArthur came to her door and told her it was now her responsibility to keep the church's linen. She adds, "My mother made the grape juice and we supplied the bread, washed and ironed the linen and also all the glasses. We didn't have a car, so we carried these things down and back to the church until 1958. When Stanley Glenn, the future principal of Knox College, was the church's minister, Rank remembers how a church member named John G. Macdonald accidentally knocked over all of the communion bread during one service while Glenn was in the middle of a prayer. They had to put it on the plate again. But most people in the church were not the wiser. I guess they had their eyes closed, although Rank says it was quite a job to keep a straight face. J.K. McCreary was St. Andrew's minister from 1939 to 1940. At that time, he was a bachelor in his 30s and apparently could not be expected to feed himself. So, a family from the church agreed to move into the manse and supply the minister with board and rooms. In the years when S.W. Hurdle was the church's minister, the numbers had declined, and it was now a 3-point charge with Aurora, Richmond Hill, and Thornhill. Hurdle lived in Richmond Hill, so the church rented out the manse at this time. By 1948, the church was a single charge again. In a 1951 general meeting, the church chose to make an addition to the building. A hall was added to the church's north end, which still stands, and you can see how it looks today. Before the church had this lovely hall, it had to rent the basement of the nearby Masonic Hall and other places. Church members had become tired of using other spaces. As Rank writes, "We had $9,000 thereabouts and decided we were tired of carrying tables 15 feet long on express wagons from the Well Street School, the Masonic Hall, the Anglican Hall, the Mechanics Hall, and the Oddfellows Hall. It was time for us to get our own hall." The women, or the Ladies' Aid Society, contributed a substantial amount to the cause. Before then, the church had a tiny kitchen, but no sink for the dishes, just a floor drain under the table. And they used a funnel to get rid of the dishwater. In 1961, Louis Fowler became the church's minister and held the post until 1967. By the time he came to St. Andrew's Aurora, he had more than 30 years' experience in the ministry. He wrote multiple books and at various times was the deputy clerk and principal clerk of the Presbyterian Church in Canada's General Assembly. He'd figured it was a small church. He'd have time to write a book. But as Rank says, how far off could he have been? Because by this time, we wanted a new church. As Fowler himself put it in an interview years later, "I thought I'd like to take a small charge and maybe do some writing. In 6 months, I found I'd been completely had." When the church asked for a loan from the Bank of Montreal for the new building, the bank manager told Fowler, "The head office thinks you people have bitten off more than you can chew." Fowler thanked the manager and told him, "That's all we Presbyterians need to hear, something to make us angry, and we'll be on our way." To pay for the new building, the church sold bonds to its members. It also posted a remarkably passive-aggressive advertisement in the local newspaper. The ad targeted Presbyterians who were not active in the church. Although it claimed its purpose was not to solicit funds, the advertisement stated, "This letter is to afford an opportunity to those Presbyterians we have named to fulfill their obligations to their church, and thus to discharge their conscience in obedience to the faith they have professed. As the scripture states, faith without works is dead. We therefore, through this advertisement, give the call of the parish to those of our obedience with whom previously we have not been in touch, that they may respond as their conscience, if a true conscience, may direct." Not long after, a United Church member said he liked the Presbyterian spirit and handed over a $500 check. Fowler and Ralph Rank took apart the church's old organ, laying out all of its 300 pipes. And they put it together again in the new building. Fowler was exhausted, and a picture was taken of him sleeping in one of the pews. Later, he joked, "In the history of Christianity, I defy you to find a single example where the minister was the first to go to sleep in his own pew." He added, "Quite a few have gone to sleep since then." When the dedication of the new building approached, the church had run out of money for a carpet in the sanctuary. Rita Rank asked how much it would cost, and a member of the committee told her $1,000. Rank reasoned, "That's just 100 people at $10 each." So she accepted donations from a number of people who were in the room. Soon she had gotten to $99 to put down a deposit. A nearby Jewish traveler told her, "If you're that sold on whatever you're collecting for, here's the other $1." Then the church held a carpet party in the family of one of its members. A local chef decorated the family's living room, and the Presbyterians placed a large glass bowl for donations with food. People were lined up down Mosley Street. They had never heard of a carpet party, neither had we. As it was, the church raised $1,300, more than they needed. And the rug, which you see in this picture, the blue rug at the front of the church, was completed in time. This story of the church's carpet party was later dramatized in a 2003 play on the church's history, written by a former editor of the Canadian Society of Presbyterian History. In 1971, the church's 100th anniversary, former Minister Stanley Glenn returned as the guest speaker. To commemorate the anniversary, members of the church tried to imitate the way people had lived 100 years earlier. Reverend McAvoy and many of the men grew beards, while the women dressed in centennial dresses and bonnets. This is a picture of Reverend McAvoy and his family. The church catered for many events throughout its history. At one time, the church provided the food for a banquet at Wells Street Public School for a board of trade. They carried the dishes for the turkey dinner from the church and nearby Masonic Hall. They discovered that the turkey they had bought smelled terrible, but they had to serve it anyway. Rank was amazed that no one got sick. The church has also had a wide variety of children's organizations. Rank found herself, she was frequently amazed by how much children could do and for all the fundraising that the children were able to accomplish. In February 1975, at the end of Homer McAvoy's last sermon, he said, "When this church was built, the contractor made all the doors open outward. I suppose this was for fire regulations, but to me it is symbolic. The church's doors open outward so that by the Christian stewardship of concerned people, the bread of life can be given to all people." When this sermon was printed, the anonymous epilogue asked, "Can we pick up the challenge of his example?" In the words of the 2003 dramatization of the church's history, sometimes the voice of the congregation has swelled, as in the early 1920s and late 50s and 60s, but sometimes the voice dropped to a dry whisper. Even so, since 1871, in times of prosperity and times of weakness, St. Andrew's Aurora has been a fixture in the community. Even in frugal times, again and again, the congregation managed to achieve great things because of the creativity and resourcefulness of people of all ages. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Robert, and thank you for both of our panelists. Now we are going to move into the questions and answers. So if you have questions, please raise your hand virtually or physically, or you may leave it in a chat room. And if you are not familiar with how to raise your hand virtually, on the bottom of your screen, there is a smile icon and there says reactions. Click that, and there is a raise your hand function. So please do that. Oh, yes, please go ahead. John Bergery, please. Yeah, please unmute yourself.
Up here.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm even more challenged than some other people. A question for Stuart about the what happened in 1982, I think it was that a declaratory act that was passed that said you could have liberty of belief, but not of action? Which always seemed kind of funny to me, because how can anybody regulate what you're thinking? So really it had nothing to do with belief, as you can't act. But was that rescinded at some point? Or is it still on the books?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm going to write it down and follow it up, John. The debate gets, as you know, confusing. And I tried to lay out what was happening when, as clearly as I understand it, and also bring in what I understand to be the important issues happening in Montreal. I think that really needs to be part of the story. I'll check that out. It's very interesting, the precision of language that Presbyterians have used about this. So a different way of answering your question is, and I get what you say, so how do you can believe anything, but you have to act this way. That's odd. But notice that they do not use liberty of conscience. But what's also interesting is that we have liberty of conscience on chapter 23 in the ordination vows. But if I remember correctly, it's liberty of opinion on the other section, whether you accept the degrees of consanguinity as laid out in the Westminster Confession. So I'll have to look that up, whether it's ever been rescinded. The one point, as you could hear, that I was trying to make is there's no reference to liberty of conscience being given in 1966. And I think that's interesting that that's crept in.
Right.
But the Declaratory Act, I will follow up on that. Thank you.
It just seems the last time I looked in the Book of Forms that I thought that Declaratory Act wasn't there anymore, but I could be wrong.
I will check, yeah.
But the other thing and this is just an observation, it seems curious to me that it was stated there would not be freedom of action in 1982, but when was the final decision made? I guess just this year, whenever it was about the LGBT question, freedom of conscience, or liberty of conscience was granted. Freedom of action. So that seems kind of curious. So there's been an about face in the thinking of the church in the last, 40 years.
Well, and here I'm going to get technical. And again, I think we have this weird thing, the chapter 20 in the Westminster Confession on Liberty of Conscience, which I looked at again, and I really don't understand it. So let me be honest about that. But in the practice, I don't get what it's trying to do in the 17th century. But liberty of conscience in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, rightly or wrongly, has been, if there's a divisive issue, we agree we can disagree on this issue, and we disagree ahead of time. And that's what brought the church together in 1875, as you know. And so that's the difference. It's making that decision as you're doing something. The current situation is different in that it's not bringing churches together. It's trying to prevent them from splitting, but that would be the parallel. But I would add that what's interesting is in the debate on I'm going to forget the name, King of Kings, the book by Gordon Petty, and the debate on the church-state relations in the 50s, they're really negative towards the granting of that liberty of conscience in 1875. So yeah, there's been some very different opinions on the church on what we can agree with and what we can disagree with. So it's very different. What would have happened had someone asked for liberty of conscience in 1966? That might have been a different issue. But I just want to say, from what I can gather, everything I read, that didn't happen for multiple reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Is there any follow-up questions or comments on this question? If not, there is a comment in the chat room that from Reverend McCutcheon that irony is too much, doors open out, and the sign up on the pews is keep out. So, Robert, do you have any comments on that?
Well, it's just the reality of the picture being taken during COVID. I guess all the tape is up because of that.
Great thing.
Robert, I have a question. Is that a new sanctuary or a remodeled sanctuary? I couldn't tell.
Oh, so this is the sanctuary that they built in 1962 with the fundraising that I mentioned in the paper. It looks a little different than it did when it was first built in 1962. The Celtic cross was added later, and some of the pews were removed to be more wheelchair accessible, and the position of the choir has shifted a bit over the years, but the carpet has changed, but it's certainly very similar to what it was in 1962. And the previous building in the same spot was there from 1873 till when the new one was put up.
So they built a new church hall in 1952 and then a sanctuary in 1962?
Yeah, so the hall that they built in the 1950s was incorporated into the newer church. So when you go outside, there's slightly different brickwork on the hall than the sanctuary. But then when they built the new church, they took the stained glass window that was at the front of the old church and they actually added it to the hall.
Thank you.
Thank you. MJ, I think you have a question.
Yes, I do. Robert, if I may, you mentioned about the minstrel show not being allowed in the church. So my question is, was that theological? Was it political? Was it understanding that minstrel shows are racist? What was the motivation not to allow it?
I mean, she doesn't elaborate on why. I like to think it was some combination, I guess, of those. Yeah, she doesn't give a direct reason, just she refused to.
Thank you.
Could I venture a guess on that one? Could I venture a guess on that? That in that era, probably it was just that it was secular. It was worldly. Wasn't sacred.
I suppose, although
Who knows?
the church did approve the play at the same time, though.
Don't know that.
But wasn't the play about the church's own history?
No, so this was the play, Lillian Mortimer play, The Path Across the Hill, that on the posters was unfortunately mistyped as The Path Across the Hell.
Thank you. Reverend Hutton, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you both for the presentations. Question for Stuart. Stuart, one of the things that's always been kind of a curiosity to me is the similarity and difference of the Presbyterian Church and the United Church. And I've always thought that the ordination of women process was maybe more different between the two denominations, in the sense that the United Church ordained a woman in, I think it was 1936. But at that time, it was it was stated explicitly that a woman can be ordained, but it's to remain the exception. And then it was not until, I believe, 65 that all women could be ordained, including married women. And I always thought there was a little bit of a difference in the Presbyterian cultural process where the ordination of all women sort of happened all at once. And I wonder if, in light of what you've said about how ordination of women started in the Presbyterian Church in the mid-60s, but it remained somewhat of a debate until the 80s, when it actually became more prevalent for women to be ordained. I wonder if maybe actually there are more similarities than differences in the two denominations' cultural approaches to that, and it just, United Church was just a couple of decades ahead.
Yes. So let me quickly answer that complex question. Good to see you. I think there is more commonality than we give credit. I think the big difference in the United Church, it was the allowance for women to be ordained as elders. I think that's the real difference. And my mother was an elder in the United Church before she was married to my father. What becomes the real issue in the 1950s, long before they're thinking about women as ministers, is women serving in presbyteries, women serving in on sessions, and women being at General Assembly. And that becomes a bigger issue. And so that's why in the other paper I did, I talk a lot about, all these convoluted schemes they came up with. And I'm not saying everybody agreed with them, by the way, but they tried to come up with these convoluted schemes to get women in the courts of the church. And I believe it was Louis Fowler who came up with one of those, oddly enough. We can almost have parallel things. So in the reality, the churches are not as different, because my understanding is the United Church is that married women couldn't be ordained as ministers. And so, and that really is a fundamental difference that we have to recognize. And it's also interesting that the first woman to be ordained as a minister in the Presbyterian Church in Canada was single. And the person before that, who was proposed in 1960, was single. What I'm not aware of in the United Church is if there has been any discussion on the opposition and whether that was widely held. My suspicion is there wasn't, but going to the topic of this paper, I'm going to say that similar opposition was voiced in different places. So I think there's a rejection of some of the changes, and it's different issues that become the ones that people get really excited about or angry about, or with so on. And so obviously the ordination of gays and lesbians is earlier in the United Church of Canada. So that's going to be a flashpoint issue. But it'd be interesting to know, Will, if there was the same attitude to the program to combat racism. I would just be interested in that.
Great, thank you. And
Thanks,
it's 1 p.m. So I think we can have one or two quick questions. And I think Dr. Airhart has one. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that, yes, Stuart is right, that the issue was over whether to ordain married women in the 60s. And what's interesting is that the initial report that was done, the commission that was set up to look at it, actually recommended that they not be ordained, that their view of ministry was that it was a full-time vocation and that married women had a vocation to the home. And what happened is that the report was eventually referred to, at the 62 General Council, was referred to the executive, and the executive made the recommendation against the recommendation of the initial report that married women be ordained. But it was also at a time when the church was examining what to do about the employment of women in society. So the gainful employment of women, as it was called, working women, what to do about working women and how to support them. Very different reports. One saying, no, we don't want to have married women as leaders in the church. But on the other hand, this different commission saying, yes, here's what we are doing for working women, because that's the way society is moving. So just to put that bit of refinement on what Stuart said.
Dr. McCutcheon, you have a...
Yeah, just a question for Phyllis. Do you think that recommendation was more tied to Bardian theology and complementarity in the United Church, or do you think it was more argued on the basis of biblical texts?
I think it was just resistance to change, actually. I don't think it was all that Bartian, and there was some effort to defend it. Interestingly, if Stuart remembers the document that we used about advice to brides and grooms that Earl Lautenschlager gave at the same time, I mean, he was giving the same advice to all women. You shouldn't be working once you're married. And that was the old view. And he defended on it on sociological grounds as well as theological grounds, that this was just not good for women, among other things, and not good for men for sure. But he was referring to health authorities and others who were proposing that the workplace was no place for married women. Not much Bartian stuff in there at that time.
Stuart, do you have follow-ups for that?
No, I think we probably need a break before we go to the annual meeting.
Okay, thank you. MJ, I think you have a question, but you can directly ask to Stuart or Robert.
It was actually just a comment with what Phyllis said about, because the deaconesses still were not allowed to marry after women who were ordained were. And there was actually an apology to the deaconesses for the injustice that was issued. I think it was 2003, Phyllis?
I don't know the exact year, but it was surprisingly recent.
Yeah.
And the deaconesses were always problematic. I mean, Will is right in saying that there was ordination in 1936, but before that, in 1928, there had been a recommendation that the church ordain deaconesses rather than ordaining women to word and sacrament. And it was voted down when it went to that vote in the 20s, but it was hard to know whether people were voting against it because they thought it was wrong to ordain women as deaconesses or whether they were against ordination altogether. But by 1936, it was passed because it was clear that men and women are eligible for ordained ministry, and yet they still would not ordain married women.
Thank you. Dr. Macdonald will give the instructions for the next section.
So we are going to just keep it to a 10-minute break. So we are going to start at 1:15. So what we would ask you to do is I would like to come together and call us to order as a meeting. And probably this is my ministerial habit. We may probably not open normally with prayer, but I am going to do that. So let us pray. Eternal God, we are grateful for the past, for what has been passed down to us. We are grateful for those who study the past and share their knowledge with us. Bless this society that we may serve you through helping to understand those who've gone before us, understand them with compassion and insight, and may we do that in all that we do. These things we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
We sent out an agenda to everyone, and often what we do at Zoom meetings is we then share the agenda, and that takes up the whole screen, and then we can't see anyone, and it makes the meeting very hard to manage. So what I'm going to suggest we do, with your permission, is we're just going to go through the agenda. If anyone needs a copy or wants me to run through it before we approve it, I would be more than pleased to do what I can on that. It's a fairly straightforward agenda where we're going to approve the agenda. We're going to approve the minutes, and then we're going to have various reports. So, but I am, if that sounds agreeable to everyone, rather than taking up the screen, I think we're just going to move forward. If that's agreeable. So the approval of the agenda is that we're going to adopt the minutes in a moment. Then we have some greetings, regrets. We're going to have a moment just recognizing members who have died. And then we're going to have some reports and do new business. Is there anything else that needs to be added? Not seeing anything. Could we have a motion? And if you could just unmute and say who you are so Ian can take that down in the minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll move it. John Vaudry.
Thanks, John. Do you have a seconder? Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you. All in favor? You can just raise your hands because I can see everybody, so that's great. Opposed? Okay, thank you. That's been carried. We did not have a meeting in 2020, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So our last meetings to approve are actually in 2019. And so do we have a motion to approve the minutes of the annual general meeting, Saturday, September the 28th, 2019, and those were distributed? Ian.
Just a couple of corrections on those minutes. On page 1, I have a correction in the name of a guest. It is Nori Anderson, and I believe that should be Nori. I'll make these adjustments and I'll send you the minutes. And then on page 3, the second paragraph on page 3, it makes reference of Robert Revington as being a master's student. He's actually a doctoral student. So that correction will be made, and those will be in the revised minutes.
Thanks, Ian. And do you want to move the minutes?
Sure, I will move the minutes.
Do you have a seconder for Ian moving the minutes?
Seconded, Richie Robinson.
Thank you, Richie.
Actually, I just glanced at the minutes now, and in the 2019 minutes, I'm listed as Reverend Doctor. I'm not ordained, so that should be corrected.
We'll correct that as well.
Thank you. I'll make that change.
Anything else? If you do notice any little corrections later, just let Ian know. We'll correct them and distribute them. All in favor of the minutes is distributed. Opposed? Declare the motion carried. I'm just going to, Marilyn, I'm going to come to you in a second for greetings from the National History Committee. But I just want to say welcome. I'm glad to see everyone. And I look forward to seeing everyone in, or I want to say, I look forward when those of us who can will be together, and we will invite others who are remote to be with us again, because I think as a society, we're working and we're committed to trying to make sure that we have folks from across Canada who can participate. So we will keep working on that. But I do hope we can actually be together as well next year. So welcome. Marilyn.
Thank you, Stuart. Stuart, I enjoyed your talk this morning, and I just want to let everybody know that I am an elder at McNabb Street Church in Hamilton, and I've been an elder since 1978. And my first General Assembly was 1980. So ever since then, I have been involved, and very involved, in the Presbyterian Church, and thank God for that. Today, I reflect and am pleased to report from the Committee on History for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And we've had an exciting year, mostly because we've moved the National Presbyterian Museum that has closed to the new site and call it the Presbyterian Church Heritage Center. And as the former convener of the Presbyterian Committee on History and now secretary and as well the chair of the new Heritage Center's advisory team, I find myself always looking at the word history. History in our church, whether the museum or now the Heritage Center, the archives at 50 Winford, Heritage Sunday as we celebrate once a year, the second Sunday in February. We still look at things with the eyes of faith, and that faith is continuously making history. And so today I want to just again reflect on this Presbyterian Heritage Center. It's going to be called PCHC, and it's only about 35 minutes up from London in North Middlesex in Ontario. And it's right in the center of the Synod of Southwestern Ontario, with CNOB Synod right next door. And in these times, we have had the opportunity to renovate the sanctuary of Carlisle United Church, which was Presbyterian up to 1925. They have allowed us to take over the sanctuary, renovate it, take out the pews, make space for all our showcases and hopefully a chapel in the future. And we are getting prepared for the opening in a few years. But right now, we appreciate your help and support. And I just want to bring that to you today, because we as a church over the next few years are going to be hearing about this campaign for the PCHC, and announcements will be made and so on and so forth. And we're just looking for your help and support. And I wanted you all to know about this, and a campaign is going on. And we really appreciate your support for the future. And we realize it's challenging times, but we want to know you to know, and thank you for allowing us to share this with you today. And from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you. Ian Mason moved the museum from Toronto up to Carlisle on July 15th. It was a hot day and everything came in nicely. And as you know, St. John's in Toronto is now going to be condos instead of a church, and we had to leave Toronto. We've looked for space for so many years, and Carlisle fit the bill. So thank you again for your support and your enthusiasm and sharing this with others and our Presbyterian friends. We truly appreciate it. And on behalf of the Committee on History again, thank you from the Presbyterian Church in Canada as well. Take care.
Thanks very much, Marilyn. And thank you to Ian for all his hard work as this Heritage Center is coming forward, and we will be intrigued and interested. We often think of archives and documents, but material history also gives us some really great insights. Ian.
I probably should just mention St. John's will continue on. Marilyn didn't mention that, but St. John's will continue on as a church, but in a much smaller space in their new renovated building.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful to know. Ian, actually, the next few items on our agenda are really yours. You'll take a list of the attendees and regrets. You've got some there, and you may add to those.
Sure. I'll just go over the regrets that we've received very quickly. There have been some new ones since I sent out the agenda. Kim Arnold, Reverend Peter Bush, Al Clarkson, Dr. Duff Crerar, Dr. Clyde Irvine, Dr. Paul Laverdur, Ian McKechnie, and Reverend Dr. Jack Whittock. So those are the regrets. For the attendees, I'll just go very quickly. I do want to make sure I have everybody. Dr. Phyllis Airhart, Sid Castle may be there. I think perhaps that is Sid's phone number at 613. Reverend Dr. Brian Fraser was going to join us. Zenon Godzik, Brian Graham, Richard Lansing. Those two gentlemen are both new members to our society, so welcome. Darlene McKenzie, Dr. Beth McCutcheon, Reverend M.J. Perry, Marilyn Repchuk, Robert Revington, Reverend Richie Robinson, Margaret Stevenson, and Reverend John Vaudry. If I've missed anybody, please let me know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, actually,
Ian, John Hutchinson, I am here, so you can add me to the list.
thank you. And I see the Andersons are here too. Reverend Dr. Bob and Reverend Priscilla Anderson are here too.
And Robert Dean, I'm here as well.
Thank you.
This is one of the big challenges with Zoom, right? Other things are easy, but this is the stuff that we all struggle with. Thank you very much.
Ian, I may not have been paying attention, though I'm here also.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you, Ian. Yep. Okay. Ian McCready.
And Will Houghton is here too. And Will, I know I've just mispronounced your last name. That seems to be my day. So, but Will's here.
Thank you.
We would note with regret the death of two members and two really important members. Father Ed Jackman, who many of you will know, contributes to the entire life of the history of the churches in Canada, not just the Presbyterian Church, but the denominations and the Catholic Church, and a big benefactor to the whole field of Canadian church history. And then we also, and you'll see this in my report, but we also not lost our editor, Kate Revington. So we're just going to take a moment of quiet and remember them, and I will end that with a brief prayer. So just let's take a moment of quiet. For all your servants, O God, we give you thanks, and for these we remember now. Help us to learn and remember all of their gifts, and we are grateful for what they have given. These things we acknowledge through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
The next thing I want to do is just the president's report, and I will just, we distributed it, but I will just highlight one or two things. We made a decision last year to go ahead with a virtual conference. We did not know how to do a virtual business meeting. And like everyone else, we thought, hey, we'll be back together next year in 2021. And that has not proven the case. And so this year we decided a slightly different format, but we're grateful to everyone for their continued support. We have just mentioned the loss of our editor, Kate Revington. I want to acknowledge the help and support of John Cleland, a graduate student at Knox College, who with myself, the two of us worked together and we've helped to put the papers together. Robert Revington has been kind enough to get them printed, and we just have not been able to coordinate everything to get those papers to Ian for distribution in the COVID situation. So that's why we're just a little late, and we do apologize. But if all goes as planned, I'm getting them tomorrow and I'm driving them to Ian next weekend. So that's the plan. And so let's hope that works. And I think it will. So that's just what we will be doing. And we'll get those out to you as we're able. I think for this coming year, we've got some interest already. But if anyone we will do a general call for papers. If there's a particular theme you'd like us to highlight and encourage people to do papers on, that would be great. I think one of the things we found on some of the theme years is that people were working in different areas, and this then allows people to present. So we're looking forward to that. And we will make that call for papers, and we already have some interest. So thank you very much. And I will entertain any questions if anyone wants to know anything that or wants to talk about or raise a question or a concern. But that's what we had to make that interesting decision and pivot last year. MJ.
I'm just curious if there's an update on the accessibility of the archives yet.
I can report on that. You are allowed to go in, but to drop off things, but I don't think as of yet to sit down and look over articles and archives. Maybe Ian knows more than I do.
So just
I think
go ahead, Ian.
I was speaking with Kim maybe about 2 weeks ago, and she said that the archives had just opened to have researchers, but you will certainly have to make an appointment to use the reading room before you go to the 50 Winford Drive.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And just to be clear, so that's the Presbyterian Church in Canada archives. Some of us end up working in other archives as well. And I think we all know that this has been, for historians, this has been a real challenge, the closure of archives. I think more than many disciplines, we've really been struggling to have access to resources in this period. Libraries can buy electronic books, but unless they've already been involved in a massive digitization process, archives, it's a different beast. So thank you for that. I would just remind all of us as we move forward, check the websites of these archives, because I think they're going to go open and closed. Perhaps let's hope they just open. But I'm always aware of that, even ourselves at Knox, what we're able to do and not able to do. So thank you. I'm going to turn then, Ian, the secretary, your report, please.
Okay. And I just noticed, I think that I've determined who the 613, I think that may be Dr. Donald McLeod, past president, with a 613 area code.
Great.
You'll note that I'll just run through this. I distributed this secretary's report just in the last day. I'll just also highlight the fact that we have new members. So we'd like to welcome our new members. That's Reverend Dr. Brian Fraser, Brian Graham, Richard Lansing, and Dr. Beth McCutcheon. So welcome to our new members. Thank you very much. As far as membership is concerned, we have currently 70 members with 5 complimentary memberships. Then I went on in the report just to outline the process of promotion and that I do that throughout the year. Of course, doing that with more vengeance in the month of August, just prior to our conference. I have noticed a problem with MailChimp. My wife has noticed this within her own museum. She works for a museum for a municipality, and MailChimp mails, the mass emailings are now getting flagged as spam for the corporation that she works for. So I'm becoming a little bit reluctant to use MailChimp as much, and may resort to general email mass mailings. Just a thanks to Ian McCready, who is our webmaster and who maintains the website as well as the Facebook group. So thank you very much, Ian. And then finally from Kim Arnold, she asked that I make this announcement to the Society about the departure of Bob Anger, who was the assistant archivist and was played a key role and was so much appreciated by researchers throughout the last 22 years of his work at the Presbyterian Archives. In April of this year, Bob departed from the archives and moved with his family to a new home in Thamesford, Ontario. A new assistant archivist has been hired on a 1-year contract. Nicole D'Angela begins October the 18th, and Nicole has previously worked at Victoria University Archives, the Toronto Roman Catholic Church Diocesan Archives, that's the Archdiocese Archives, and was currently doing information management with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan Office. So that concludes my report.
Thanks very much. Any questions for Ian? I'm going to move on. Is Sid here, our treasurer? He was experiencing computer difficulties earlier today. I don't see him, but sometimes there's different names. And okay. Ian, we'll have to talk about that in a second. But Ian McCready, as the webmaster, would you like to, is there anything you'd like to bring to our attention, Ian?
It's there. Go visit it. Enjoy it. Let me know if there's any problems.
Okay. Well, and that's a good way to do it. And thank you for doing it. It looks really great, and the papers are up there. And I think sites are one of the ways we've kept moving forward in this. So I think that's really, really been helpful.
My only regret is I'm sometimes a little tardy. Poor Ian. I physically ask him, send me a reminder in case I forget.
Not a problem. Thank you, though, for doing that.
Rick is much appreciated. Thank you.
Ian Mason, so the treasurer's report we don't have, but our sense is that membership is strong. We're spending on the kinds of things we spend on, which are distributing the papers, putting on the conference. Membership is one of our main sources of revenue. And so we really do appreciate people's membership and support of the society. And we will be sending out the financials after this meeting. Have I missed anything, Ian?
No, I don't think so. I think Sid did indicate to us this morning that he was planning on sending the financial report. It was going to be a verbal report that he was going to give this afternoon, but he said that he would provide us with a printed report, so we can send that out to our membership when we receive that.
Yeah. And I just want to acknowledge when things go south on computers, they just go south. And that's an odd phrase, but you know what I mean? When they go wrong, they completely go wrong. And so I suspect he's been trying to find a link to the meeting and not having email. So we just acknowledge that. Our next item of business is the election of officers. And it is my understanding that Ian is willing to continue as secretary. Sid is willing to continue as treasurer, and I am willing to continue as president. So we probably need a motion or a coup d'etat. If anyone would like to be president, you're free to overthrow me. That would be fine. But if everyone's happy, we'll do this for another year. Particularly until we meet in person again, or with most of us in person. But we would need a motion that this be the slate of the executive. Moved by Marilyn, seconded by MJ. Is there any discussion? And I'm not going to call for nominations to be closed. If we're all in agreement with this, everybody in favor? Opposed? Declare the motion carried, and thank you very much for your support and encouragement. This leaves one office vacant, and I just want to talk about this. And I think what I'm going to suggest is a motion to the executive and giving the executive power to issue. We need to find an editor for the society. We need to find an editor who can work with us. If there's anyone who would like to volunteer, we're more than pleased to receive that. But I think what we need to do is empower the executive to go and search for someone who can be our editor. One thing I will say is often our editors have been quietly toiling out of sight. One of the great things of the only good thing is I've really got a sense of how much work this involves. And I think we've been looking at a variety of things from having done it this year. I think we can talk more to someone about what's involved in this and what the process is. So I think that's a good thing. But I think we just need a motion to empower the executive to seek out a new editor.
Stuart, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
I guess I can say this now, and it certainly was never a complaint or anything, but just something to be aware of that when my mom was the editor of the Society's papers for all those years, I remember that she made the comment once that if she had charged her usual hourly rates to the Society, just depending on where you get the editor from, it's yeah.
Thank you. And let me put it more directly, not because your mom would have said this because she was so gracious about this, but we discovered that John put in 20 hours himself editing. And so you can do the math, 20 times $25 an hour, which is a really low fee, but that's what we pay at Knox. So that, but our stipend at the moment is $300. And so we really, we will probably be coming back to the next meeting with a recommendation on that. So we just need to be aware of that. So thank you, Robert. And as I said, having seen it, I get a real sense of what it is we're asking people to do.
Could I make a comment? I was just in touch with Sid Castle by phone.
Yes.
And he will be on if you just wait a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. That's great. We'll wait for Sid then, and we'll keep going on everything else. We're on this.
Stuart,
Yeah.
I was going to ask, is there any chance that Kate's gift has been passed on to Robert? Gift of editing? Maybe he's too busy.
I have to think about it. It will depend where I am with my dissertation. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, John, for that very wise suggestion. And the committee will take that under advisement and speak to. His thesis supervisor will also be protecting his time, though. And that's me. So I'm going to split myself down in the middle, encouraging him and defending him. But thank you. That's a great suggestion. Could we have a motion? Welcome, Sid. Could we have a motion just to empower the executive to seek out a new editor? Moved by Beth, seconded by MJ. Actually, seconded by Richard Lansing. Sorry, Richard, I didn't see your hand quite quick enough. Any other discussion? If not, all in favor? Opposed? Declare the motion carried. Thank you very much. Sid, welcome. And if you want to, you need to unmute.
I apologize, Stuart. I misunderstood the timing.
Not a problem. So could you just give us a bit of an update on the finances? That would be great, Sid.
I apologize. I've had computer problems, and I'm going to have to restore some of our financial information. But at the end of September, I estimate that our bank balance will be approximately $1,886. And of that, we will have to probably have some expenses incurred that will have to come out of that. So, but I'll have a financial report to you by the end of, I hope by the end of this week. I hope I can get the information restored. Yeah. I sincerely apologize for this. For the other members that are with us, I also gave Ian some problems in producing the membership report, and I apologize sincerely to you, Ian, for that.
Oh, no problem, Sid. No problem at all. I do have a question in terms of the balance. Does that include payment for the printing of the papers, or has?
No, I haven't had that invoice yet.
Okay.
So that's what I was estimating. It might be approximately $500 in expenses by the time the everything is gathered together.
Right.
That was the $500 expense estimate that I was.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. And when computers go down, it's just massive work rebuilding them. So we really do hope that goes well.
Well, fortunately, it's backed up, so it should be fine.
I hope that works, Sid. I really do.
Sure.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to skip down the proposed papers. We've had a call to paper for this year's conference. We're going to do the same kind of thing for next year's. I suggested again, an open call for papers. If there comes a point where you think we should have a year where we focus, that would be great. I do think, though, that those always work best when we give people lead time. What I mean is, if we're going to focus on something, if we announce it a year or so ahead, then people can start working on it. So that just a thought. New business. Very pleased that the first recipient of the Reverend Dr. Mel Bailey bursary is Robert Revington. So we're really pleased about that, and I thank Robert. Ian, did you have anything else? And congratulate him. Ian, did you have anything else on this item?
There was concern about the disbursement of this. So at our last meeting in 2019, Dr. Clyde Irvine had made a suggestion that we might use this fund for travel expenses for students from other colleges, such as Presbyterian College in Montreal, who could make a paper and that who could submit a paper, and that would be used for their travel expenses as well, in addition to the awarding of the Mel Bailey bursary. So that was just a concern we had. A little bit of, I guess that was in response to the fact that we had never spent any money. We had never distributed any funds from that bursary. So in the meantime, Dr. Jack Whittick is one of our members, and he is also a theological professor at two universities, one in Uganda and one in South Africa. And I suggested to him that I wonder if any of his students in those colleges would have anything to write about Canadian Presbyterianism, or some connection either directly or remotely to Canadian Presbyterianism. So that was a possibility. So we may have new papers that we are able to solicit, and perhaps you have some ideas too that potential students. So we may not need to worry about. I guess my concern was I've always had a pet peeve against funds that just sit there and are never spent. So it sounds as if we're making some good inroads into spending some money on Mel via the Mel Bailey bursary.
Agreed. And so the executive will continue to monitor this, because I think it's not good stewardship to have money that you can't get and use, and we can use this. So thank you. The invitation from Michael Stainton for a participate in a proposed symposium in 2022. What month was that? I didn't look at that. Ian, what month is that?
I don't think he was specific. I think he said spring.
So just be aware that the executive is aware of this and thinking, so you might get some notes about it. And do we need a motion to add these papers to the website, or are we just alerting the society that we're going to be doing this?
That was a project that Bob Anger had offered to do, because those are available very readily at the Presbyterian Church archives. Now Bob has moved on, so we may be at a little bit of a standstill with that project.
Okay, so we will look into that then, Ian, and just make sure that that keeps moving forward. Okay.
Stuart, could one of the things I should have mentioned, memberships have been coming in right up until yesterday morning, but it's not too late to send in your membership. We have lots of room for it. So if you would do that, I'd be glad to see it. And the membership dues we've received are $830 so far.
That's great. Thank you, Sid.
I should have announced that. I apologize.
Not a problem. Is there any other business? If not, are we ready to adjourn? We need somebody to move adjournment.
I wouldn't dare.
Robert, Dean? Oh, Ian McCready. Seconded by Robert Dean. Okay. All in favor? Thank you, everyone. We're going to keep to the schedule. So it's going to be a little shorter break, but we're going to come back at about 2 o'clock or very shortly after that. And we're going to turn the proceedings over to Dr. Phyllis Airhart. So take a stretch, grab a coffee, some water. We're really pleased to have as our speaker, Phyllis Airhart. Phyllis D. Airhart is Professor Emeritus of the History of Christianity at Emmanuel College. She's also cross-appointed to the Department for the Study of Religion at the U of T. She is the author of A Church with the Soul of a Nation, Making and Remaking the United Church of Canada, which was the winner of the 2016 Book Prize for the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion and shortlisted for the 2015 Canada Prize in the Humanities for the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. It is a great book, as well as a number of other books and articles on religion in Canada. And so Phyllis is a distinguished church historian. She writes, and I'm just going to read it, among her most memorable experiences as a teacher was teaming with Stuart Macdonald for the course Calvin Wesley in Canada. So Phyllis and I had the great joy and pleasure, and I hope our students felt the same. I think they did, of teaching together for many years when every other year we would do this course. And so it is a real pleasure to welcome to the Society Phyllis and ask her to present this paper. So Phyllis.
Okay, I will begin by commending the CSPH for its ongoing support for the study of Presbyterian and Reformed history, and by thanking Stuart for the invitation to distract you with the occasional mention of the word Methodist. What I'd like to do this afternoon is explore how institutional identity is both reflected in and shaped by the stories that institutions tell about themselves, by the stories told about them by others, and how those stories change over time. The stories that the Unionists and anti-Unionists told about themselves and their denominational rivals during the controversy over church union contributed to the bitterness after the consummation of union in 1925. These stories also cast a long shadow over the Presbyterian Church in Canada and the United Church of Canada after 1925 as participants in the international ecumenical movement. The first part of my presentation makes use of some research that I did for an article in the journal Church History titled "The Accidental Modernists, American Fundamentalists and the Controversy over Church Union," that expanded on a section of my book that Stuart mentioned. The second part focuses on ecumenical Protestantism after the Second World War. One of the issues that vexed the ecumenical movement during the 1950s and beyond was the changing concept of world mission as being both geographical, that is, missionaries proclaiming the Christian message around the world, and programmatic, the people of God being the church in the world. The shift in emphasis from supporting missions, plural, at home and abroad, to God's mission, singular, in the world, provided an occasion for rethinking church union and denominational identity in a rapidly changing context. However, these different understandings of the purpose of the church not only divided denominations from each other, as in the past, but from within as well. And I was thinking about so many links to Stuart's paper this morning because of that aspect. However, these different, rescription is a term used by Nick Nisley and Stedman Graham in their work on organizational change. Rescripting describes a process they have used in working with executives who find themselves stuck in dysfunctional storylines when an organization fails to meet its objectives. They encourage leaders to consider an alternative script to find a future narrative that will identify what's needed to become unstuck. In my book, I used the notion of rescription to understand the remaking of the United Church as it grappled with the uncoupling of Christianity and culture after the Second World War. What I will do in this presentation is explore the Presbyterian experience of rescripting. First, the attempt to rescript the identity of the pro-union opponents before and after 1925 to cast them in an unfavorable light. And secondly, attempts to rescript their own ecumenical identity to meet the common challenges of religious and cultural pluralism. So first of all, rescripting church union in the 1920s. The controversy over church union in the 1920s exposed differences within the Presbyterian Church in Canada about confessional identity and the place of the institutional church in society. But these same matters were on the minds of Presbyterians elsewhere. The debate in Canada grew more raucous when those opposed to it exchanged tactics with the party in the Presbyterian Church in the USA, the PCUSA, that was waging battle over these issues under the banner of defending the fundamentals of the faith. Much to their chagrin, union supporters in Canada found themselves in the crosshairs of J. Gresham Machen, then of Princeton Seminary. As the leading spokesperson for confessional orthodoxy, Machen famously fought theological modernism. But as historian D.G. Hart notes, Machen's antagonism to early 20th century ecumenism has generally been overlooked. Ecumenical unity was, in Machen's view, quote, often a union with the world against the Lord, or at best a forced union of machinery and tyrannical committees. He dismissed the social programs of what he called the modern church as having more to do with bettering conditions on earth than preparing for heaven. The mission of the church was strictly spiritual and only indirectly, at most, to Christianize the social order. A turning point in the Canadian controversy came when Machen's attack on modernists in his own denomination was rescripted and applied to supporters of church union, thus casting a group of mainly moderate evangelicals into the role of modernists, or worse, apostates who could no longer be considered Christian. His book, titled Christianity and Liberalism, appeared in 1923, securing a prominent international role for Machen in the debate over theological modernism, just as a pivotal new phase of resistance to church union was beginning in Canada. Anti-unionists now came armed with a new line of attack, bluntly accusing the unionists of harboring modernist tendencies. Methodists, once spurned by some Presbyterians as faulty in their theology, owing not to modernism, but because of their reputation for aggressive evangelism that more staid Presbyterians considered unseemly, were targeted as the chief source of this new threat. Anti-unionists winked at those in their own ranks who were closer to being modernists than fundamentalists in matters of doctrine, as they attempted to rescript their resistance to church union as a defense of the faith. In retrospect, what is striking is that there is scant evidence of either the basis of union or Methodist theology being tagged as modernist before the 1920s. Even those who later became critics initially praised the new doctrinal statement when it was first issued in 1909. It was not the substance of the doctrinal statement itself that first caused consternation, but a provision that Congregationalists had insisted on in keeping with their tradition of defending liberty of conscience in matters of faith, that ministers need only to be in essential agreement with it when they took their ordination vows. Even so, this issue was not new to the Presbyterian Church in Canada, according to Daniel J. Fraser, professor of New Testament at Presbyterian College, Montreal, in an article published in the Harvard Theological Review in 1915. Despite his own opposition to church union, Fraser considered essential agreement with the basis of union a compromise that would provide relief to, quote, many a sensitive candidate for ordination who felt torn between intellectual integrity and insincerity. A few years later, when he became the president of the Presbyterian Church Association, an organization with the express purpose of thwarting church union, such comments would come back to haunt him. Anti-unionists now claim that the church formed by the organic union of the Presbyterian, Methodist, and Congregational Churches of Canada will be a church without a creed, said critics. Meanwhile, strong support for church union among respected conservatives and moderates made for awkward alignments once opposition to union was reframed as a defense of the fundamentals of the faith. The anti-unionist efforts ultimately failed to prevent passage of the United Church of Canada Act, which stipulated that Presbyterian churches would become part of the United Church on the 10th of June, 1925, unless the majority of a congregation's members voted to remain outside. The last hope of preserving the Presbyterian Church in Canada was thus to limit their losses. In a letter to union supporters in 1924, George Pidgeon confided that he had heard a rumor that the antis were planning to use some new ammunition to raise doubts about the theological soundness of the uniting parties. His suspicions were confirmed in the pamphlet and periodical warfare that ensued, when the antis used arguments similar to Machen's in Christianity and Liberalism as a blueprint for casting Methodists as not only liberal, but apostate. It was an attention-grabbing move aimed at damaging the theological reputation of the Unionists. And I had to leave out examples, but you can see if you check at the Accidental Modernist article in church history, I was able to put some of the examples from pamphlets and newspaper reports in that article. Methodist leaders in Canada were stunned and furious to hear their church described as not only creedless and modernist, but now even apostate. Machen and other critics of church union had signaled that doctrine was not the only reason for alarm. Church union opened a new round in the ongoing debate about the church's role in Canadian society. The denominations that formed the United Church of Canada had been strong supporters of the missionary movement of the early 20th century that gave rise to the modern ecumenical movement. The first of several votes on church union took place in 1910, the same year that an extraordinary missionary conference was held in Edinburgh, often considered the first international missionary conference, as well as an event that was of crucial importance for the modern ecumenical movement. But there were also important links to Christianize the social order, a theme that, along with evangelization, was emphasized at the Edinburgh Conference. Peter Bush's excellent book titled Western Challenge details the commitment of Presbyterians to missionary work on the prairies and the North in the decades before church union. Methodists made their way to those same regions for the same reasons. Concern that wasteful competition would impede that advance became a compelling reason to support church union. The missionary movement, with its many voices, deeper pockets, and undeniable link to the evangelical impulse of the past, joined the cause of moral and social crusaders in aiming to Christianize all areas of life. The story of church union in Canada, as presented by its supporters, pictured Protestants cooperating to create an efficiently run church that would shape the nation by instilling Christian values. Critics belittled their aspirations and condemned the creation of one big church. The underlying theological and institutional tensions that had stoked the controversy before union continued beyond 1925. Machen's supporters shored up fundamentalist attacks on the new denomination, perpetuating inside of Canada and even beyond what United leaders believed to be a distorted image of their church that was creedless, modernist, no longer evangelical, and perhaps not even Christian. The largely concocted but convincingly publicized rescripting of the United Church's identity transformed middle-of-the-road pragmatists into innovators whose theology was suspect, a reputation that proved difficult to shake. It was a Canadian influenced by the Swiss theologian Karl Barth, whose direction proved to be more decisive for the continuing Presbyterians than Machen's. At Knox College, Walter Bryden championed a theological perspective unlike either fundamentalism or modernism, or even the progressive orthodoxy of the moderates. Yet he too shared suspicions of the United Church's modern assumptions and joined fundamentalists in repudiating both its inclusive statement of faith and ambitions for a public role in Canada. Bryden's ecclesiology also disclosed a complaint that was common among anti-modernists, anti-unionists, and anti-ecumenical Barthians, which he laid out in 1934 in a book titled Why I Am a Presbyterian. The doctrine of salvation was ignored, he said, and the task of the church as an enterprise had become paramount. He feared that some of his Presbyterian co-religionists were in danger of going where the Unionists had led by, quote, estimating themselves and the significance of their church in the light of this country and the conditions obtaining here alone. And now the second part of my presentation, rethinking missions and rescripting church union. John Moyer's history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada closed the chapter titled The Long Crisis of Church Union with these words, each parted without charity for the other. But as the 40th anniversary of church union approached, most of the old wounds left by the controversy over its founding had seemed to heal. By 1963, relations between the two churches were so friendly that a local newspaper reporter had the temerity to ask the minister of St. Andrew's Presbyterian in Kitchener, himself a former moderator, whether the United Church was Presbyterian. Answering yes, Finley G. Stuart explained that those who had continued as the Presbyterian Church in Canada had resisted church union because they were, quote, opposed to organizing the kingdom of God. But the United Church had since evolved, as he put it, and what he called the old Methodist traditions had not remained in the fabric. More evidence, perhaps, of the success of the anti-unionists in rescripting Methodist identity in the 1920s. Asked whether the time had come for Presbyterians to join the United Church, Stuart retorted that it was, quote, just as fair to ask why the United Church doesn't return to Presbyterianism in name, since it already has in fact. He predicted that union might happen within a generation. There was more than one approach to ecumenism emerging in the Presbyterian Church after the Second World War, as part of what John Moyer called a civil war within the church. What he referred to as the opening shot was fired in opposition to support for ecumenical missionary cooperation in the 1940s that equated ecumenism with theological modernism. By the time the World Council of Churches met in New Delhi in 1961, there were signs that the customary way of thinking about missions was in flux. The temperature of the debates shot up when what was referred to as traditional evangelism was castigated by some prominent ecumenical leaders as a distortion of the church's true mission. In A Church with the Soul of a Nation, I described the impact of ecumenism, and in particular, this new approach to missions on the remaking of the United Church. I suggested that around the 1960s, the evangelical roots of the progressive movement were grafted to the philanthropic work of home missions to show the United Church as the flowering of the social gospel movement, thus downplaying the importance of the missionary movement in the making of the United Church. Missionaries became social reformers, providing education and health services in small communities. I would argue that there was a similar remaking of the Presbyterian Church and its understanding of mission. Both denominations were shaped in significant ways by ecumenical commitments that provided a common language for rescripting their identity after the Second World War. Both were influenced by new approaches to outreach that shifted the focus from missionary enterprises, missions plural, to making an effective Christian presence in the world as the church's mission, that critics saw as a repudiation of efforts to convert the world to Christ. One of the leaders in promoting this new approach to mission was theologian Joseph McClelland. In 1965, as Presbyterians celebrated the 40th anniversary of their resistance to church union, he complained that his church had wandered in the wilderness for those 40 years, using the memory of the controversy in a futile attempt to create a confessional church mystique and an evangelical ethos, and raising doubts thereby about the United Church's pedigree. His warnings in years to come about his denomination's insularity from the world and its coming obsolescence echoed United Church concerns about their own future. And his call for a new blueprint for mission triggered disagreements that were like what the United Church and other denominations were facing. McClelland portrayed a Presbyterian church that practiced the same civic piety that critics associated with the United Church. He equated evangelical Christianity with, quote, an ethos of conservative middle-class Puritanism and an accepted part of society that right-minded citizens were expected to join. But times were changing, he warned, and the church hadn't yet changed with them. His blunt assessment was stated in words that could just have easily been written by so-called radicals in the United Church. The lines have shifted, and we are not where the action is. He challenged the claim that evangelicalism entailed the separation of God and the world, insisting rather that, quote, the direction or orientation of the Christian, of the church, is toward the world. He who looks steadfastly on Jesus Christ looks on God's worldly activity, on his presence in the world. Alluding to what he called the classic words of Evanston, reference to the World Council of Churches General Assembly held there in 1954, he insisted that to evangelize is to participate in Christ's life and ministry to the world. McClelland's efforts to rescript mission echoed the case for support of church union in 1925 in cautioning that denominationalism was a danger, not because it prevented unity, but because it hindered evangelism. when he asked in 1965, have we discussed church extension in our church courts without being conscious of the shadow of the United Church as our rival and threat? 2 years later, in an address to a Presbyterian Youth Congress, he put his concerns in cheekier terms. There is no Presbyterian mission. I'm as sorry about that as you are, but there isn't. Christ is the missionary. His is the mission. The only question is to what extent we participate in his mission. As for what he liked to call 1925 and all that, he was just as blunt about what he called our 40-year operation. And here I'm quoting Macdonald again. Isn't everyone tired of looking at all our scars and hearing about the surgery? Or to change the metaphor, aren't people tired of hearing how we once defended our virtue and preserved our virginity? What McClelland and others, such as Stuart Coles, who were active in the ecumenical movement, were proposing was a radical restructuring of church and ministry that entailed a rescripting of the story that Presbyterians had been telling since 1925 as a step toward remaking identity. Ironically, ecumenical initiatives designed to bring churches into closer cooperation by emphasizing their common mission instead created new divisions, as had church union in 1925. Despite the new spirit of cooperation, and perhaps even exacerbated by it, there were deepening differences about how to be the church in the world that divided those committed to Christian unity from each other, as well as from conservative evangelicals. There were tensions between the Presbyterian Catholicity advanced by those such as David Hay, who were active in the World and Canadian Councils of Churches, and the confessionalism of historian W. Stanford Reed, who had studied with J. Gresham Machen at Westminster Seminary. Reed agreed with Joe McClelland's bleak picture of the spiritual health of the Presbyterian Church, but offered a different diagnosis. And here I'm quoting Reed. We must now face the issue of whether we wish to continue as Presbyterians, Reed retorted, or whether we are prepared to accept a revolutionary position which will largely eliminate our specifically reformed witness in favor of something much more general in preparation for the next big church union movement. Stuart, do I have about 4 or 5 minutes left?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Despite indications that both churches were moving beyond the bitter controversy over church union, some of the same issues from 1925 resurfaced 50 years later. An open letter signed by some of the most recognizable names in the two churches was published in June 1975 on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Presbyterian Church in Canada and the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Church. It called for reconciliation and urged that a committee be set up to study the possibility of closer relations. 2 years later, the Presbyterian Record reported on promising proposals for mutual recognition of ministries that had gone forward for discussion by each denomination. But less than a year later, an editorial titled "Backward Christian Soldiers" announced the disappointing result. The 1978 General Assembly failed to move forward with the recommendations, despite the United Church's willingness to do so. The editorial blamed those opposed to it for picking at old scar tissue, dragging old biases and fears out of the cellar like rusty relics from past battles and displaying them like trophies. The discussions seem to have reminded some in the Presbyterian Church of the old quarrels, and the outcome reflected the persistence of those old scripts. I'm going to cut my conclusion, some of my conclusion out, but I will just say that the Presbyterian Church and the United Church now operate in a post-denominational context that neither those for nor against church union in 1925 imagined. Old assumptions continue to influence how they see each other and how the Canadian public sees them. I suspect there is still lingering annoyance, if not antipathy, that surfaces among Presbyterians when the United Church takes a liberal approach on controversial issues, even if the United Church might point out they adopt a similar position later. The United Church is still widely assumed to be theologically meager, and the Presbyterian Church thought of as less socially active. Identities scripted by each other during the first church union controversy. Ecumenical leaders still insist on the importance of proclaiming the Christian message to those outside the church, but struggle with how to do so in an increasingly diverse context. The dilemma has only deepened as we see growing numbers of those who are wary of the past influence of Christendom, including in Canada, the legacy of missionary work with Indigenous peoples. The construction of identity has tended to emphasize choices that were different or differently timed. I've highlighted the mission of the church, but other examples include remarriage of divorced persons, the relation of church and state, sexuality and gender, including the place of women in the church, Christian education, climate change, and of course, the legacy of the residential schools. And yet, as I looked at the websites of the United and Presbyterian churches and compared their ecumenical partnerships and theological statements, it was hard to overlook how much they have in common. And I illustrate that with some material that I don't have time to give. But as for theology, whatever one might think of the style of Song of Faith, it's hard to argue that it lacks theological substance. And I have a bit of a comparison of the Living Faith statement from 1984 and the Song of Faith. The narratives that resonate with us in shaping the stories of the past, the leaders and lessons we select, reflect who we are, and perhaps as significantly, who we hope to become. Can the past be rescripted as a source of renewal? The past may not have changed, but how we view it has shifted. Marilyn stole the punchline of my last sentences of my presentation, which read, I will draw your attention to an item in the Presbyterian History newsletter that was appended to the announcement of today's conference that Ian Mason circulated over the summer, relocation of the collection of the former National Presbyterian Museum to Carlisle United Church. It noted that the congregation of Carlisle United Church, quote, generously agreed to permanently rent their sanctuary for a modest fee for use by the Presbyterian Church Heritage Center as an exhibit area. According to his report, the United Church congregation graciously agreed to move downstairs.
Thank you, Professor Airhart. We now have a time for questions from the audience. As before, people are invited to, if you know how to raise your hand virtually or in some other fashion.
And I hope Stuart will step in to save me when, because he, of course, is much more familiar, as are many of you, with Presbyterian history. And we often took questions together. I was reminded when I was writing the paper of one of the sessions, the last session. What we would do is have the last hour of the class ask us anything. And I remember one student who asked us if we were trying to start a new church union movement, because we seem to have so much in agreement and we're presenting the history in ways that seem to make it the similarities really highlighted. we assured him that wasn't the case, but Stuart helped me out.
John, do you have a question?
Yes, Phyllis, I often think when you talk about church union that, I don't mean you, but anyone talks about church union, that it's so full of anomalies and it's very hard to figure it all out. I remember Professor Markell at McGill in church history saying that he once received a letter from a minister who had gone through 1925, a Presbyterian minister, who wrote Markell and said, I'm having my communicants class, and some of the young people are asking why we Presbyterians stayed out. Could you please help me and tell me why did we stay out? And I think that there's a lot of that. Yes, there was Machen, and he sent students up to Canada from Princeton, and he spoke in Knox College, he spoke at Presbyterian College, and one of my professors said, we listened to him politely. There was Machen, but there was also Bryden. And it seems to me there was a kind of coalition for a long time of sort of traditionalists, evangelicals, Calvinists, all kinds of people for a long time. And I don't know just when that ended. I was going to say too, just to come back for 1 second, that you mentioned Daniel Fraser. And of course, he was quite liberal.
Yes.
And he in the Presbyterian Church, and George Pigeon, who went into the United Church, had students spying on him to get statements of some of his heresies. So, it just wasn't as simple as saying, we can't join those apostate Methodists. There were lots of apostate Presbyterians who stayed out of the Union. But it just seems that, somewhere, I don't know when it was, because I observed both churches for a long time. And about 1975, I remember I went as an observer to the General Assembly. I called them Young Adult Observers then. And my sense was it was very traditional in a way. The ministers all wore their robes, the moderator had his ruffles. And if you looked at some of the things that came out of the Acts and Proceedings, my former minister had written an article for the Church Doctrine Committee on evangelizing children. Well, you never would have seen that, I don't think, in the United Church. And it seems to me that somewhere along the line between 1970 and today, there's been quite a paradigm shift in the Presbyterian Church. It's become much more like the United Church. And yes, it's hard to see any difference today. Stands the United Church took, the Presbyterians took 10 years later, 15 years later. That's just kind of anecdotal and from where I sit. But I think there was a bit more difference 50 years ago, but I don't see very much today. If you go to General Assembly today, it's completely different, both in style and content from what it was.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that has happened is that the differences within the denominations have become sometimes deeper than the differences between them. And
Yes.
And you see that in for instance, the Stanford Reed, for example, was very involved in the renewal movement within the Presbyterian Church, and you had something similar in the United Church. And I think that it's interesting how there was dissent within that sometimes was as significant. And you get, I think, also one of the things that fascinates me is how evangelism is viewed. And how evangelism becomes proselytism somewhere in the 1960s, and maybe as part of that shift in thinking about missions and missions. That's one of the things I'm interested in. But I've worked, thankfully, before the COVID thing hit, the summer before, I did some work in the archives in Ottawa, the Canadian Council of Churches. And I had also done some work in Geneva with the World Council of Churches. And I was interested how how some of the issues kept recurring, and evangelism was one of those key issues, that the E word, as we call it in the United Church, so troublesome in some circles, and yet how the resurgence of conservative forms of evangelicalism with the neo-evangelical movement, Billy Graham, Carl Henry, and others, how that too, I think, in addition to some of the developments that Stuart mentioned this morning with the rise of moral maturity, I think those things have shifted the way that denominations see themselves and how they see each other. Stuart, I don't know if you have a comment based on your research in that period.
I have a question, but I'll begin with a comment. I think what I find interesting is there are periods when the two churches are very close and very similar, and then periods when they're not. And so what I think is interesting is in the 1960s, Phyllis, there's definitely this period where the churches come together. I think they drift further apart a little after that. They might be closer now, but I think it's interesting. There was a time, I always go to, it's an incident, but when Bob Rumble didn't become moderator of the United Church of Canada, that always struck me as a moment where the churches were changing. Bob was a family friend and someone who I really looked up to. And I found that seemed to me to be a culturally different moment. So but by the 1960s, there is a lot of commonality, maybe drifts, maybe we're back. That's my question was just, I thought it was fascinating around the scripting part of what you're talking about. And this idea that the scripts that you get given, oh, you're the guy with the bad cowboy hat, you're the guy with the good cowboy hat. Those are the scripts that the churches live out. And so Presbyterians are less social gospel, whatever the heck that means. United churches are less theological, which isn't necessarily true, but everyone assumes they're true. So I think that's something I want to keep thinking about. But I was interested, you were talking about Machem and his attacks on the church. Did the editor, Ephraim Scott, the editor of the Record, did he pick up, have you found some evidence in his book that you would point to as similar language? Because what I found in his book is more the defense of the Westminster Confession of Faith. And I've made the argument that part of what he's doing there is defending the property. But have you found other evidence in for him being drawn in by Machem?
I think there was some correspondence where he actually during the pamphlet thing, I think I recall that he actually questioned somebody at the Presbyterian Church Association and saying, is this really happening? You know, is this questioning the charges that were being laid against the Methodists? But I think in some ways he was working from the older script, and yet even he, when the Basis of Union, the theological statement first came out in 1909, he had a piece. There's an editorial in the Presbyterian Witness where he was editor, initialed ES. That praises the basis of union as a faithful statement, and so that may reflect his, before he got involved in defending the property kind of, but he changed his mind, and the creedless church is something, whether it was Machem or his own way of thinking, a creedless church was something that he continued after church union in the book that he published after church union. You see that, and the criticism of the big church, that too, which I think is interesting. I mean, Machem's comments, some of his writings about that aspect, I think Darrell Hart is right in saying that people forget about his problems with an inclusive church and the big church, and his defense of religious liberty. He put it in terms of religious liberty and against government bureaucracy, but also church bureaucracy as well.
Thank you.
Nurse MJ.
I was wondering, Phyllis, when I heard you, because what I'm hearing is the similarities of trends at the denominational level. As someone who's been ordained in one of the denominations and worships currently in the other denomination, I see some day-to-day practical polity things that are extremely different between the two, and the role of clergy versus like the teaching elder of the clergy role, which is not the United Church role. And again, what you referenced, the song of faith versus the living faith. And there was one other that popped into my mind, and I can't remember it right. Oh, right. The essential agreement. Like, I don't think anyone ever thought, well, one paper I read did know that eventually it would lead to other things. But all of those differences, is it just that it's not denominationally different, but in those day-to-day things it is?
Well, I think in some ways, both churches have become more congregationalist. And I think so much depends on what happens at the local level. And I mean, my thinking about the United Church and the restructuring is that it's likely to become more congregationalist in its day-to-day operations. I just think that there's a great, I know that's true of the United Church, that it makes a difference which United Church you're at. And I mean, the three United Churches along the few blocks of Bloor Street where I live, Bloor Street, Trinity St. Paul's, and St. Andrews are very different in the role of the minister and the role of the council, the role of the worship committee. So there are differences, and I assume to some extent maybe the presbytery still has more of a way of regulating what goes on in individual congregations. But I think that certainly the United Church, at the time of that statement by Finley Stuart, if you'd asked the United Church, which church in the United States is most like the United Church of Canada, by then I think they would have said Presbyterian. Whereas at the time of church union, I wouldn't be surprised if people thought that it was more similar in a lot of ways to the Methodist Church, because the Methodist Church was the largest. Now, I think the United Church of Christ is more similar. There's more of an affinity there than certainly the Methodist Church, and perhaps even the Presbyterian Church.
Thank you.
Just a comment on Ephraim Scott and Machen. Ephraim Scott was the editor of the Presbyterian Record, and he invited Machen, or he got permission to print his address that he gave in Canada at Knox Church, and I think he gave it in other places, entitled The Mission of the Church. And in that sermon, Machen says, "You are a city set on a hill." And he thought that the Presbyterian Church was going to be that strong, reformed, conservative denomination that was going to preserve the confession. And I think he misjudged the situation completely. I don't think he understood what was really going on in Canada. It wasn't the Stanford Reed type of person that was dominant in the church. Neither was it really Joe McClellan.
Yeah. And
they were both on the fringe.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that part of what I looked at in my article, and Don McLeod has looked at this as well, the role of Machen and in connection with Knox College. Because it's clear in what I was looking at that there were some in the Presbyterian Church in Canada who wanted Machen to be the first principal. And he had sent that City on the Hill reference that you mentioned from the sermon. He had sent a similar letter to the people who stayed behind to continue the Presbyterian Church in Canada, commending them, calling them City on a Hill. And Machen was so sure he was going to get that promotion that he turned them down, and then he was snubbed by the unusual move of the board and went off to Westminster Seminary. And it was Westminster Seminary that the Presbyterian Church in Canada would turn to for its ministers. And I was struck by Stuart's mention that the person who had the liberty of conscience issue was a graduate who was refused ordination, was from Westminster. So there was that long connection. But the other thing is that those sermons that Machen reprinted, I talk about this a little in the article, they were actually given, first of all, and it's clear in I think in the text of the Presbyterian Witness, that these were lectures, presentations that he had made in the United States, and he was giving them in Canada. Basically the same. He was doing a tour and doing lectures in Canada and the United States, and this was something that he had given previously in the United States. So the city on a hill would have made more sense there than in Canada. But it's so interesting to think what would have happened if he had said yes and they'd been able to get him at Knox College, rather than the person who became the first principal, who was quite different from either Bryden or Machen initially. So yeah, counterfactual history.
Could I just make one other little comment? And that's that I think after 1925, my sense is the Presbyterian Church in Canada was so struggling that they were willing to take anybody. So we took Westminster grads, we took Irish, all kinds of Irish guys, no offense to the Irish, but just Bible school people. It was quite a coalition. But by about 1970 or somewhere in there, we can afford the luxury of saying no to some of those people. And some might even argue that at least part of what the ordination of women thing was about was to make it difficult for those Westminster people to come into Canada. They were troublemakers, some of them, one way or another.
Well, and one of the interesting things in terms of the way that they viewed themselves initially, one of the reasons why I was intrigued by this Machen thing was before I ever started doing this work on the book on the United Church, I was presenting a conference paper on Methodism at an event where George Marston was also in attendance, and it was my first time meeting George. So he was saying, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I grew up in New Brunswick, near Moncton." And he said, "Oh, New Brunswick." He said, "My father was a missionary to New Brunswick." And I said, "How did that happen?" He said, "Well, he was a Westminster Seminary graduate, and he was persuaded by the Presbyterian Church to go as a missionary to New Brunswick because they had need of ministers." So yeah, it's interesting.
Professor Dean, I wasn't sure if you were raising your hand or not. No. I actually have a question. In Bryden's book, Why I Am a Presbyterian, he doesn't make this essential to his argument, but at one point he discusses how the pro-unionists would point to the passage in the Gospel of John that they all may be one. And then he suggests that the more recent biblical criticism, at least at that time, would question the authenticity of that passage. And given the perception of the United Church being the modernists and the Presbyterians being more traditional, it made me wonder if you've noticed anything about Presbyterians, perhaps when it suits them, employing what could be modernist ideas against the Unionists, and even the Unionists using what could be called more conservative interpretations of Scripture against the Presbyterians.
Yeah, I think they're both quite selective in how they prove text and use Scripture. I mean, I think that using that text is one of the weakest arguments for church union. As I look back, I mean, it was convenient, but you know, I agree that it was often stretched beyond what one might do with it as you know, as a biblical scholar. But the role of the Bible in this is interesting, because I think and Fraser is fascinating to me. I mean, he actually I think and I thought of this when I was listening to Stuart's paper. He felt that there was something similar that could be read into some of the 1875 Union materials that were leading in the same direction as the essential agreement, that the language that was eventually chosen. And I think there were certainly Ephraim Scott felt this way, that it was a slippery slope, that this was going to lead to theological looseness. The Catholics felt the same way. They thought this was bizarre, and would lead to Unitarianism was the main thing. But Fraser is interesting, because he thought that there were similarities with some Presbyterian standards, and the Congregationalists were doing it in a way to affirm the Congregationalist tradition, which was a higher standard, that you had to be able to defend your faith, not do away and say that doesn't make any difference. Although I have to say that I think now it's become a way, again, the way that stories shape you, and how big the charges made in 1925 are used in different ways now. And I suspect theological candidates for ordination do view it perhaps with relief, as in much the same way as Fraser acknowledged.
I think we have time for one more question. I noticed that you're unmuted. Dr. Goodman.
Oh, yeah. I think it's sort of been, I think Dr. Airhart sort of responded in some of her comments. Dr. Macdonald's question earlier, as I was listening to the paper, it was sort of resonating with me, just the way that these scripts shape and mutually reinforce one another. So not only are the anti-unionists portraying the pro-unionists as modernists and modernist, creedless, non-evangelical, but I mean, maybe Dr. Airhart, you can reflect maybe just a little bit further on, I mean, in what way does that story, the opponent's story, in some way shape the ongoing story as well?
Well, I think it can, but in other ways, I mean, the part that I had to leave out, that it was fascinating to me, the language of the Living Faith document that indicates that we're making a theological, we're putting together a statement of what we believe now, and it's very similar to a point that is in the Song of Faith, that we're doing this not for all time but for our time. That sentiment, which is different in some ways, a little bit different than what Bryden was doing, but was very much like what the pro-unionist Presbyterians would have said, those who constructed the basis of union. affirming that we're not making a statement, that each generation has to do its own statement of faith. Similarly, the view of the openness to the faith of other religions was interesting, because I was surprised that it was as close to some of the ideas that the United Church and the World Council of Churches were only beginning in a controversial move to say that God is active in the faith of all people, in other religions. That very controversial statement from the report of the Commission on World Mission in 1966, that was ahead of its time, and yet it was just very interesting. And I thought, actually, when I looked at the ecumenical partnerships, the display of ecumenical commitment on the Presbyterian website, the United Churches was almost a little more parochial. I mean, I thought in some ways the Presbyterian, maybe it's probably just that they've got a better website designer, but also the commitment is just as strong. And I think, like MJ, I would find it very easy to look for a Presbyterian church that I would feel comfortable to, based on what I saw on the website, at least.
Thank you, Dr. Airhart, and thank you to all of those who asked questions. I'd like to take this opportunity, if you're able, to give a round of applause to our presenter.
And my friends, that does bring our conference to a close. We're really grateful for everyone taking time out of their day. I don't know what your weather is like wherever you are. If it looks like I'm in the middle of the night, it's quite dark here outside at the moment of pouring rain. I hope you've still got some sunshine, but we really do appreciate your time, and we're grateful to all our presenters and for the continued support for Presbyterian history and the study of history. And you can see some of the interesting themes that people are looking at, from congregations and how they evolve and go through things to some other topics. And we really are grateful for your attention and support. So I'm going to call it a conference. Thank you very much. And we hope to see everyone next year, either on screen or in person. So take care. Thank you very much. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Robert. And thanks, Junwan, for working in behind the scenes.
Yeah,
I do want to say that. Thank you to Junwan and Robert for all their work behind the scenes. That really matters to make this flow as smoothly as it does. So I'm really appreciative of both of them. So take care, everyone. Have a great day.